Well, g'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I've got something slightly different. I'm actually going to share the presentation I recently gave at the Birdlife Photography Conference. Now, I gave a talk on why we should process our images. I know many of you are interested in this topic, so I hope you enjoy.
Please welcome duade.paton.
Thanks, Adrian, and thank you to everyone that's turned up. I really do appreciate it. I've had a great time so far listening to all the other presenters, and I think it's just amazing that we have the opportunity to get together in our little niche hobby of bird photography. So I'm really happy to speak to you today. Obviously, I just want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Commonberry people. I think imagine what it was like before Europeans turned up. I can only imagine what it was like with the bird life, that's for sure. Before I get started, when we do presentations in the modern era, we've got to give trigger warnings if there's anything that might offend you or you might find upsetting. So I'm just warning you that there might be some images that you find upsetting. Those images are birds on sticks. There's been quite a lot of talk today about not doing birds on sticks, but you can clearly get quite nice shots with birds on sticks behind the moon, and even getting little sacred kingfishers on sticks with nice big spiders. So, you know, we don't discount the old bird on a stick, and there will be some photos like that today. As Adrian mentioned, I've got an addiction for bird photography. Who else has got an addiction for bird photography here? Okay. I think once we start, we just can't stop. And I've been very fortunate to be doing this for probably 11 years now. In that time, I have failed a lot. Who else fails on a regular occurrence? Yep, I definitely fail all the time. But it's because we fail that we learn. And that's why I'm here today standing in front of you, is because I've failed a lot and I've learnt a lot. And I want to share with you what I've learnt over my time. What I am going to show you today is why processing is important and how I use Lightroom to go from an image like this of a mulga parrot to an image like this. So there's quite a difference there, and this is just using Lightroom. So that's what we're going to look at. But I'm not going to stand here for the entire hour talking about Lightroom. That might be a little bit too boring and it might be a little bit too hard. So what I want to do is I want to talk about our personal style, trying to get it right in the camera before we even edit it. It's much easier to edit a good photo than trying to edit a bad photo. So if we can get it right in the first place, it's definitely a lot easier. And then is processing even necessary? And I'll argue it is, but I'll show you why it is. It's often because the camera and we get it wrong and we have to fix it. And that's where processing comes in. So just in regards to personal style, we often like what we like and we don't know why we like it. But I just want to show you two images and I want you to pick which one you think is the best, or the one you like the most. So the first one is the sacred kingfisher, and it's got a little crab in its mouth. So a nice habitat type shot. And this next shot, the same species, same lens, but clearly bird on a stick. And they are quite different. Just out of curiosity, who prefers this image? Yeah, quite a few hands. And who prefers this image? Okay, probably slightly more on that one. Okay, that's interesting. Let's have a think about this. Two bee-eaters on a stick and looking in the same direction, and then two bee-eaters looking in different directions. So who prefers the image on the left? A few, yep. And who prefers the image on the right? More. Okay, fantastic. So we all have differences. What am I trying to highlight here? What am I trying to show?
There's no one way.
There's no one way. We all have different likes, we all have different preferences, and at the end of the day, we're taking these photos for our own joy, and it's important that we discover what we like, and we're doing it for us. We're not doing it for other people. As soon as you start competing with others, you start to lose the joy of photography. And we all have to remember why we started this hobby. There's been a lot of talk about competitions. There's been a lot of talk about social media. I don't care about that. I care about getting out with my camera, getting out with the birds and taking the photos. And I take these photos for me first. If other people enjoy them, happy days. If you enter them into a competition, great if you do well. But I don't want you tying your worth and your enjoyment to those outcomes. And we shouldn't compete. We should only compete with ourselves instead of other people. So that's sort of what I'm getting at there. And this is a photo of me when I first started, and Matthew Jones, who's a dear friend who's now no longer with us. And I learnt so much from him. He was so generous with his time, and he had a certain style. He could see images I just couldn't see. And I don't know how he did it. We'd go to the same location, and he'd come away with images like this, which is one of his most amazing images I've ever seen, of these pelicans. And I love chatting with him, and his style has influenced my style. So now when I go out, I'm thinking about the similar sorts of things. You know, thinking about the bird, the backgrounds, the habitat, and that's the style that I like. You may not like that, but that's fine. We all have our own style. So it's important that we understand what that style is, but we don't have to stick to one style. We can try everything. And this here last year, I've got 2 images to share with you, my favourite 2 images of last year. This one here, everyone can recognise the type of plant that is, the old kangaroo paw. So I just grew a few in a couple of pots next to my house, and then I put them out on my driveway, and the background was far away. Any guess to what bird came to visit that? Yeah, little one, spinebill. Someone said spinebill. Yep. So I just waited with my camera until a spinebill landed on that and got that photo. So very simple, just kangaroo paw, put it out on the driveway, distant background, waited, bird landed on it, took a photo. So it's just a simple style. Another style is when we just walk around the bush, and I happened to be at a wetland, and these cockatoos were coming to land and feed in the middle of this wetland. I noticed that they were flying through the shadows, and obviously a white bird, and I thought, well, I might try and take advantage of this. The R5 has the amazing AF eye tracking, picked up this cockatoo as it flew in, and I managed to get that shot, which is just the cockatoo. This is all in Lightroom. This is just because the bird was in light and the background was in shadow. So just some simple little things, just opportunities popped up, and you can just enjoy your photography and get those sort of shots. So it's really important that we do try to get it right in camera, and it just makes our life a lot easier. It's been mentioned numerous times this weekend about having a plan and thinking about what am I going to shoot? What do I want and how am I going to get that shot? So I was looking for some gang cockatoos. This bird was the first one I found in the middle of some hawthorn berries. This is not the shot I wanted. I wanted a shot with the bird isolated with a nice background. This is a nice habitat shot which shows us where the bird is. This is not what I was going for. So how did I get the shot I was wanting? I spent about 2 hours walking up and down a cliff until the female walked out onto a branch that was exposed. There was nothing directly behind it, and we got that shot. Same camera, same lens. Everything there is the same except for the position of me and the position of the bird. So just a bit of thought, a bit of planning, and I was able to get this shot, which is just completely different. So just a bit of planning there. Jan and I were in Melbourne, and we found a peregrine falcon that was hanging out on this cliff, and where we were, we took this shot, and I wasn't that happy with this shot because we sort of had the cliff right behind it. The blue ocean often isn't that good. It's nice, but we thought we could do better. And it's been mentioned a few times, why don't we just move our position? Why don't we just move and see what happens? So we move to the left. There's 3 shots in this sequence. So that we're just moving to the left. The bird's starting to get more isolated. We do now have this cliff, a different type of shot. It's okay, it's fine. But this was the sort of, we started moving around and the background started changing. And it kind of reminded us, we thought, oh, we're in the USA or something with canyons or something like that. And obviously with a bit of editing, you could remove that if you wanted to and end up with an image like this. So just with a bit of thought, a bit of thinking, moving and changing where you are can result in lots of different images, and you can just choose which one you prefer the most. Well, I guess I'll just ask you the question, why do we process our images? Why do you process your images? Someone? Yep. To improve them? Yep.
So I could see what I actually thought I saw in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you didn't hear the questions, basically to improve the image and to realise what we saw with our eyes, because often we don't get what we want. So it's important that we do process our images. It's just part of the digital workflow, and we can process images. I love this image. What does it remind you of? What do we fly in? You know, planes have landing gear, the tails, so we obviously pick up quite a bit of our engineering from birds and their habitat, just an albatross out on the ocean. So this is a raw file of a kookaburra. Can we see what's wrong with this image? What needs to be fixed? What about the colour? Is it a bit flat? What about the composition? Where's the bird? Yeah, so there's a lot of things going wrong with this image, and I was in Denoise. This bird just happened to fly in front of me and I just happened to take a photo. It wasn't planned, the bird just landed there and I took a photo. But clearly it needs to be improved. As you mentioned, the crop, there's too much dead space on the right and the colours just aren't quite right. That's not how it was. So just using Lightroom, but we can change how it looks just by cropping it and making a few changes in Lightroom to try and get the colour more how we envisaged it and how we thought about it out in the field. So the program I use or I use a few, but Lightroom is my catalogue. And how many here use Lightroom? Yeah, most people? Okay, great. You don't have to use it. Obviously, Jan doesn't use it and others don't use it. But I think I started with it, and whatever you start with, you generally stick with. And I use Lightroom as my catalogue, and I also use it to obviously edit images like these two kangaroos. So it's quite powerful. I'm just going to go through the develop module, which is how we edit our photos and make changes, and we end up with lovely shots like this. I only took that last week. I think he was a little bit happy. I'm not sure if you can see that, but when I start processing my images in Lightroom, I start at the top and work my way down. So I often start with the crop tool, which is this little thing here. And now cropping and composition is very personal and it's very subjective. How you crop an image, I'm not going to tell you how to crop an image. Just crop it to what you like. I mean, there's plenty of rules with where it should be positioned and looking into space and all these sorts of things, but ultimately at the end of the day, I just want you to choose what you like, what's most pleasing to you. I like the crop of this image, I like how it just looks. When I started, I did crop a little bit too tight. And I think that's what we have a tendency to do. This was one of my first images when I got a 400 5.6. Couldn't believe how big the bird was and how much detail it had. So all I wanted to do was make the bird as big as possible and just cropped it tight and hard. Now I do try to let them breathe a little bit more and try to have a little bit more space. And I think it's over time you just develop a bit of a style and you don't know how you do it, you just do it. I'm sure everyone's the same. You just get the crop tool and you just start cropping until it looks roughly right to you. So many moons ago, I did a 14-hour drive non-stop to Gluepot or Waikerie, and we got to Waikerie late afternoon and we heard some rosellas calling, or we heard the juvenile calling out to be fed by the adult, and we went to the cliff and we couldn't get any closer. So this was as close as we can get. And so the bird is quite small in this frame, and everyone can probably see the clear issue in this photo. We've got this massive out of focus branch that's in the way. So that sort of ruins the composition, and the birds are a little bit too small. And I often get asked, well, how much should you crop? And I don't care how much you crop, as long as the detail holds up and you like it. And it depends what you're doing it for. If you're just social media and for your own, you can crop fairly heavily. But if you're going to print, you're going to have some issues if you crop too hard. But for me, you know, I only put my images really on my website, and I have printed a few, but you just need to be mindful of that. But for this shot here, I wanted to crop it fairly hard, and I've got a little video, hopefully it works, just to show you how I use the crop tool. And generally, I started with the horizontal on this, and I started to crop and it just didn't work. I just felt like that stick was just in the way, and I didn't quite have enough material at the bottom, so I decided to go to a vertical instead, but this vertical felt a little bit too tall. So 2:3, it just didn't feel right. So for me, I generally do my verticals in 5:7 ratio. That's sort of, it's entirely up to you. You can just sort of do what you like, but I generally go to 5:7, and then I just play around with the crop, try to include foliage at the bottom, a bit of space at the top. The birds are kind of central, and that's how I sort of go through that process. So I'm just, you know, getting a feel for the image, cropping it, and when it's processed, it sort of looks like that, which is far different to that, if you see what I mean. So that is a fairly decent crop, and that was on an old camera. The final image was only around 6 megapixels or something like that, but it still looks pretty good, does it? Does it still look all right?
Awesome.
So even though that's 6 megapixels, some people might snare at that, but you know, that's how it is. It still looks pretty good to me. So I'm very happy with that. So that's sort of how I crop my images. Now, there's clearly something wrong with the image. What's wrong with this image? What's distracting? Yep, it's that water at the bottom, the blue water. And this image was actually taken in the same session as the very first image that you saw. It was my most amazing experience I've ever had. I was just laying in the mud, very shallow. We had no wind, since we can get these reflections. We had the reeds reflecting that beautiful colour, and I just laid in the ground and the birds came to me, and I was surrounded by birds. Just this feed, Lake Wollumbulla at Culburra, 2 hours south of Sydney. So a beautiful spot called Lake Wollumbulla. I spent a lot of time there. I used to live on the south coast, I no longer do, but I was just laying there in this redneck stint, so similar to Craig's talk. Obviously I love my shorebirds, and there's so much I like about this image, but clearly that bit at the bottom was too distracting. So if we just crop it out, it drastically changes that composition, and this is actually quite wide, just to give it more emphasis. And I like the ripple of the water, how it's going out either side. So that's sort of why I went with that composition. And you can see it makes quite a difference just by cropping it, and you can be very creative with how you do this, and the image will change based on how you crop that image. So I highly encourage you just to have a play around and have a feel for how you crop your images. So once I've cropped the image, we now need to fix the colour, and the colour is the white balance basically, and the white balance has a huge effect on how your image looks. And I know most of us probably shoot in auto white balance. The camera is obviously guessing a lot of the time, and the camera can get it wrong, and it can be a real challenge, and I tend to go a little bit warm just because that's my preference. Hopefully you can see there, we got me mate Gary the Galah, which is just a little toy I've got that I use in my videos, and it's shot in completely different light. The bird on the left was shot in morning warm light, so it's quite warm, quite orange and magenta and red. The image on the right was taken without any sunlight, so it's quite cold, quite cool, and they just look different, and sometimes you get different looking colours in your shots and you can't quite figure out why. It's often the temperature of the colour and your white balance will impact that. But if we shoot in RAW, we obviously can change the white balance in Lightroom. So even if you get the white balance completely wrong in the field, you've got the ability with these sliders. So if you're not aware in Lightroom, obviously we can move these sliders left and right, and that will change the setting. So on the temperature, you can go colder or warmer just by moving that slider. So often I will just get an image and I'll just move that slider until it looks right to my eye. There's a lot of things that can impact this. Obviously your monitor, the medium that you're looking at it on, it is quite confusing, and even I don't fully understand colour, but I just do it to what I like. And so this image, which I showed earlier, has anyone been there at Glue Pot? Yeah, there's a few people. Yeah, great. If not right now, but in summer, if you want to get mulga parrots, ringnecks, they have hides set up and they have a bird bath, permanent bird bath, and these parrots come non-stop. And they have a hide you can sit in and just enjoy yourself. So if you're ever in South Australia, highly encourage you to go to Birdlife Glue Pot because you're guaranteed to get shots like this. So we just obviously, with the white balance, you probably can't see it, but I'll just crop it because I don't want the left bird and I don't want that bottom bird. So I'm just cropping those out. And then I go to the temperature and it's a little bit cool, and I'm just dragging it to the right until it warms it up a little bit, so it might be a little bit too warm, but that's how I like it. And so I'm just changing those sliders until the colours look right. And you can see there's quite a big change just from changing the white balance of that image. So I just encourage you again, just to have a play with those sliders and don't overdo it, but just have a play with it. But that white balance will drastically change the looks of your image from that to that. So a bit of an improvement. Alrighty, so we've done the crop, we've done the colour. Now we just need to do the exposure and our basic adjustments. Has anyone photographed that bird? Yeah, from that talk yesterday, they were talking about spirit birds. I reckon this is probably mine. Just absolutely magnificent bird that I just love to see and photograph. We're very fortunate in Australia to have this bird. Absolutely beautiful. Red-necked avocet, if you're not aware of what it is. So we need to adjust the exposure, and obviously, we can adjust the exposure. We can go darker by going left and brighter by going right, and we can adjust the contrast. How many people underexpose their images from time to time? Everyone? Yeah. Who has underexposed an image? Unfortunately, it's just part of life. Occasionally we underexpose, and that's just the way it is. We try not to, but sometimes it just happens. And this shot here of a kookaburra, obviously I underexposed it by quite a lot. And Craig mentioned in his talk about the histograms, we can see all of the pixels are in the left-hand side. They're all very dark. We don't have enough bright pixels here. We need to shift the balance to the right a little bit more. So I can go into Lightroom and I can adjust this exposure to correct the exposure. So I can go in there and just by dragging it to the right, obviously makes it a little bit brighter. I've gone 1.5 stops, which is quite a lot. And I guess just a little tip, if you're constantly adding a stop to every image that you're ever editing, it might be a good idea to think, oh, hang on a minute, I might be getting it slightly wrong in the field. So if you're always brightening your images in post, it's an indication that you're probably underexposing a little bit in the field, and you can just make some tweaks to how you take your images in the field. But I fail quite a bit, and that's just one of those times. So once we've done our exposure, I pretty much do this on every image. We've got highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, and I'll generally play with all of them. And some of you might have already asked me, oh, what presets do you use? And if I'm being totally honest, I generally do every image individually. Unless I'm doing a batch with this exact same light, there's always going to be differences in images. And I like the process, so I just do it individually. And generally, most of the time, I just put the highlights down a little bit, and I generally drag the shadows to the right quite a bit, just to lift the shadows and make it all a little bit brighter. And the blacks is generally where I get my contrast. So let's have a look. So our kookaburra, we've adjusted the exposure. So if I just get the highlights, obviously if I drag them to the right, it's too bright. If I drag them to the left a little bit, it just tones down those bright images a bit more. And when we pull the shadows to the right, it obviously just lifts everything and it makes it pop a little bit more. A few changes to the whites, a few changes to the blacks. And in regards to the vibrance and saturation, this is probably where we can all go a little bit overboard at times. Generally, I only probably give it about between 10 and, it depends on the image and it depends on how much, but generally I don't do that much to vibrance, maybe between 10 and 20 or something like that. But again, it depends on the image. I definitely don't whack my saturation up past 20 or past 15 or anything. It just tends to oversaturate the images, so I don't tend to overdo it when it comes to the vibrance and saturation. We definitely don't want to do that. So this is the underexposed image, and then we've adjusted the exposure, and then we've adjusted those other sliders. Can we see the progression there of what's happening? And we're just doing that on pretty much every image as we go through. So this is a funny image. This is me and two mates when we went to New Zealand and we were hunting for a critically endangered takahe. Can anyone see it? The bird's saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. And we're all facing the wrong direction. But the reason for that was there was another takahe, and can we see where the light's going? Mm-hmm. The light was pointing over our shoulder into something. And there was another bird, this is the raw file. This was the bird, and the background was quite dark, but the bird was in light. So that gives us a creative opportunity now that we can darken that background and make the bird pop out. So our sliders give us quite a bit of creative freedom to just change how that image looks. So if I look at this image, I just want to make the bird pop, but I want the background dark. So if I just go into Lightroom, I just do a very little crop, just so we can highlight that bird a little bit more. I didn't have to do too much to the temperature, just turn the exposure down a little bit of contrast. The biggest thing here you'll see is the blacks when I turn those down. But when I turn the blacks down, watch what happens to the background. It kind of just gets very, very dark. And we can see that the bird kind of starts to stand out a lot more and the background goes quite dark. Give it a little bit of vibrance to make the bird pop a little bit, but just with a few minor adjustments, we now sort of get an image that looks like that, which is a little bit different and something I like it, others might not, but just by doing those sliders has changed the look. But the only reason I got this was because the bird was in light and the background was dark. You couldn't do that, it'd be very difficult to do this unless you had those conditions. So sometimes it's just a matter of spotting those conditions in the field. Oh, there's shadow and light here, let's try and have a play around. Just try to expose the bird, because otherwise the bird will get very, very bright if it doesn't quite work. Okay. So we're moving through pretty quickly, and this next one is the Hue Saturation and Luminance, and this is how we adjust colours. Who has problems with reds and different colours in their images? Like, yeah, a few people have problems with there. They might block up or they might not look quite right. Red-capped robins are notorious. It looks orange. You get all these robins and the colours just don't look right at all, and it's very difficult to adjust and fix that. So in Lightroom, I know that's very small and you probably can't see it, but on the right-hand side, it'll have this HSL colour, and you can click on all at the top, and it reveals the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. And the hue changes the colour. So when we've got all these sliders, you probably can't see it. It says red, orange, yellow, green, aqua, blue, purple, and magenta. So if the image has any red in it, just by moving that slider, we can make it more red or more pink, just that colour. So when you do saturation, it does all the colours. This here is kind of just adjusting each colour separately. So if you've just got a problem with your reds, you can come into here and just change the red slider, so you're only affecting the red colour in that image, or blue, or whatever it is, the colour that you want. And then the saturation, we can just adjust the saturation of a specific colour, and then the luminance is kind of the brightness of that colour. So I don't do this on every image. It's only when I have a problem with my colour of a certain colour that I come into here and just have a play and have a feel for how that changes the image. So this Gangang cockatoo, obviously a nice red head, and we could go overboard with this head, but it's hard to get the red right in this head. So if I use those sliders, if I just drag the hue, so red, you watch what happens. It goes like dark red, and then it goes more orange, and then the saturation, I can make it light or dark just by dragging that around. And then try and get it right. I'm sort of just going by eye to get it quite right. So I haven't made huge changes to that colour, but you can sort of see it's lighter, darker. See, just subtle change, just a subtle change with those sliders. So and it just gives you a little bit more control over those colours within an image. So highly suggest you check out the Hue Saturation and Luminance panel in Lightroom just to have a play around with how it looks. This is probably the most complicated part, but Lightroom, the latest version, so you have to have the subscription, you have to have the latest of Lightroom to have this feature. So if you don't, I highly suggest you do, because the trouble we've always had in Lightroom is we've always made global adjustments. So when we change the highlights, we're doing the highlights for the entire image. So whenever we're changing exposure or any of those sliders I showed earlier, it's impacting the entire image. And sometimes we don't want to do that. Sometimes we only want to impact a small part of the image, like just the whites or just the reds or whatever it might be. And masking allows us to do that. So for example, my totem bird here, this image, I have underexposed it slightly to protect the whites, which has caused the background to be too dark. Can we see how dark that background is? So that's our raw file. Background is too dark. So if I increase the exposure of this image, what's happened to the whites? Too bright. So what we would do is then drag the highlight slider down and it makes the whole image darker. So we don't want to change the background. We only want to change the whites of the bird. And that's where masks come in. So in the top right here, there's that circle. So we've got the crop, and you keep going across. At the top right, that's our new masking tool. And if we click on the masking tool, it brings up all these things. It says select subject, select sky, brush, linear gradient, radial gradient, colour range, luminance range. What I want to show you is colour range. So if we click on colour range, that is going to select, you select the colour that you want to make adjustments to. So in that other set, we just want to adjust the whites. We only want to make adjustments to the white. So instead of making global adjustments, we now want to make local ones. So if I take the little eyedropper, I click on the white, can you see that red? See the red on the bird? That's our mask. So Lightroom has automatically selected all the white parts of my image and it's created a mask. So those bits in red, that's not permanent, that's just showing us what area is selected. So that is a mask. So now I can make changes, highlights, shadows, etc. It's only going to impact the area under the mask. Does that make sense? Yep. So let's have a look and see how that works. So I'll just show you the exposure. So we turn up the exposure. The whites are now too bright. If I turn down the highlights, the image gets a bit too dark, which is not what we want. So I'll just put the highlights back to normal, hopefully, yep. And now I'm going to select the masking tool, and then I will select the colour range, and now I select the white. The white is now selected, and now I can make changes just to the whites. And you'll watch, see how the whites are changing? I've recovered the whites without changing any other part of that image. And now I can change the head if I want. So I select the colour of the head of the bird. Now just the head is selected. If I want to make the head a bit brighter, I can make the head brighter. If I want to change the colour of the head. So this masking tool enables you to make changes. Can you see the difference? Just using a mask. Yep.
How did you get to the, how did you put another mask in? Did you have to?
Yep, that's a good question. So if you want to add a second mask, you can't read it, there's a plus button up here. It says create new mask. So you can create multiple masks, which is it's similar to Photoshop, how we had all those layers. This is similar, we can have multiple masks. And we can just keep clicking masks and clicking on the areas that we want to alter. So that's pretty powerful that we're able to do that. Now, the other one that we can do is a brush mask. What the brush is literally like a paintbrush. We can brush the area that we want to create a mask on. So if there's a specific area, it's like dodging and burning if you've ever done that. It's kind of just selecting an area. And so for example, this red-capped robin, the black area here was too bright. I want to just darken the blacks. So I've just used a brush and I've just gone over the black area. And that green you can see, that's just telling us the area that we've created. So I've actually hit new mask and then I've got the brush and I've just brushed it on and I can make changes. And another one that's quite a new one is called Select Subject. It does exactly what you think it's going to do. It's going to try and select the subject. So if I click on that, it makes a mask around the bird. So now the bird is selected. So what can we now do to that? Make whatever changes we want just to the bird and not the background. So we can now make changes just to the bird without impacting the background at all. So if you may want to just sharpen the bird, because as was mentioned in a few talks, if you go aggressive on the sharpening, it's going to put noise into your background. It's going to impact the background. But by doing this, we're only going to impact the bird.
Can you inverse it?
Yes. Yep. So you can inverse the mask. So if you just wanted the background instead of the bird. Yep. So you could have a play around with it. It doesn't work all the time. It kind of looks like magic. It's a lot of these things you go and try at home and you go, it didn't work. Sometimes it just doesn't work, but most of the time it's pretty good. So this is my little red cap robin. So the whites are a little bit bright, and the reds, they're not really red, are they? So this is the raw file. So I ideally want to darken the whites, and I want to make that more red, and I want to darken the reds, and I want to darken the blacks, and say I want to make the eye pop a little bit more. I can do that just using masks. So let's just watch it happen. So I click the mask, I click colour range, I click the white to select the whites. The whites is now selected. I adjust the highlights just to do the whites. I'm going to create another mask and click the orange or the red, and now that clicks the red. You were talking about you can refine that edge for that colour when you're doing this. And now I'm just making it a little bit darker, but the left-hand side's going too dark for me. So what I'm going to have to do is use a brush just to do on the chest. So I've now gone mask, create a new brush, mask, brush, and now I'm just painting on the area I want to make darker. This might be a bit hard to see, but I'm painting the area that I want to make darker. So I'm just selecting a mask at the moment. So I'm just creating a mask of the area that I want to make darker. So once I've painted on where I want to darken, I can now make my changes, and you watch how it goes darker. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I'm making that darker by using that brush. So that's happening there. Now I want to make the blacks blacker. I don't want the black as bright, so I'm creating another brush, just painting it on, and now I can grab my sliders and I can make it darker to whatever I like. It looks quite bright on the TV, and now I can do, this is just a different one, just have a play. This is called a radial one, where I'm creating a radial mask just to brighten the eye a little bit, to make it pop a little bit more. No, here, we'll do the colour now. So you can see, again, the screen makes it look terrible. But you can play around with the sliders just to change the colour of how it looks. And again, you're just going to have to do this to what you like. But you can play around with those sliders to change the colours inside the image. There's a lot to take in there, but you can see there's quite a difference. And again, this TV is not doing it justice. But that's quite a few steps we're going through there. You can see the change? Yep. So just with a few changes in Lightroom, you can make all those changes. I'm going to show you now, beginning to end, from a session to what I do with the photo. So if anyone saw my YouTube video, my last one, went to the Winton wetlands, had a wonderful time, but I discovered a little GHC in the grass here as I was walking back, and we'll just see how I went through it. So there's just a bit of viewfinder footage. I picked up the bird, the AF's tracked the bird's eye, taken the shots as it was standing there. Now I've got my camera, I'm just reviewing the images on the back of the screen. So I'll give it a star, yeah, I'll keep that one. That one's soft, so I'm not even going to bother with that. And we check this one, that's looking pretty good. That one's looking at us, so we'll give that a few stars. And I literally just go through giving the stars as I'm going through the images. Just checking, that's no good, the grass is over the eye, it's not looking right to us, and then the bird will eventually fly away. And that's sort of how I go through. And I can go through fairly quickly. There's obviously 2,500 photos I've got to go through there, but I just go through it and then I get it into Lightroom. I sort it by rating, pops up, there's the image, a few of the images I took, and if I want to process the GHC image, I'll go back up to the top and double click on it. And so I've got to start with the crop. For me, it's a little bit too wide, so I just want to bring it in a little bit. We've got those dark areas in the top left I wasn't too keen on, so sort of drag it down. I'm just playing with the crop tool to try and get a feel for what I like. I quite like the shot with the habitat, the grass. I'm just playing around with the crop and the temperature. This is a bit of a hard one probably went too orange in the end, but it was very hard to get the colour exactly right on this image. So I just keep playing with it, just getting the colour and the exposure. I'm just going through those steps that I've talked about today. A little bit of contrast, the highlights, it's touch bright, and lift the shadows a bit to lift everything, and the whites, blacks, and just a touch of vibrance, a touch of saturation, just to brighten it. But for me, I'm still looking at this, the top left's still too dark, so I can actually use a mask to make that less dark. So I just hit on the mask, and I'm going to use a linear gradient, which is like a neutral density, a graduated filter. I just drag it on there, and it's graduated. So now I can just make it a little bit brighter, just to make that corner a little bit brighter. And now I'm just changing the colours a little bit, just checking those colours again with those sliders, just to make sure the colour's right. But I'm kind of noticing that the bird's a little bit dark, and perhaps I want to make just the bird a little bit brighter. So I could go select subject, but I've decided that I'm just going to use the brush tool, and I will do it. I'm going to create a little mask. So I'm just going to select the areas I now want a little bit brighter. So I'm just drawing on there with the brush. So I'm just going to want to make these areas just a little bit brighter. So I've got my mask now. I can now go to the exposure, and I can just make the bird a little bit brighter. And that's kind of where we go with that, and it's done. And that's sort of the process I go through for every image. And that's the final image of that beautiful bird. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, if you made it this far, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed giving it. If you've got any extra questions, leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer every one. So until the next video, take care, see you later, and happy birding.